Amos, along with Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah, represents the first of the writing prophets in ancient Israel. As Dr. P. Kyle McCarter Jr. describes here, the writing down of prophecy and poetry was part of a wider 8th century phenomenon occurring elsewhere in the ancient world. Amos's message, although including judgments against the nations surrounding Israel, is directed primarily toward the corruption and injustice within Israelite society. Amos declares that the influence and riches of Israel's elite are being misused to oppress the poor and pervert justice. Amos warns that if these violations of the divine covenant continue, the future of the nation would be one of destruction and exile. Yet despite the warnings of impending judgment, the book ends with a message of hope. Even though God will execute his wrath against Israel, there will be a bright future for God's people, when a king will rule on David's throne and the land will overflow with abundance and blessing.
In Greece, the 8th century BC was the age of Homer and Hesiod, the first poets whose poetry was preserved in writing. In Israel, the 8th century was the age of Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah, the first prophets whose prophecy was preserved in writing. This coincidence was not an accident. Neither Greek poetry nor Israelite prophecy was new in the 8th century. What was new was the use of alphabetic writing to record them. The alphabet itself was already old, perhaps 1,000 years old, when it was used to transcribe the oracles of the 8th century prophets. In earlier centuries, its use seems to have been limited, either to scattered individuals or to isolated centers of culture. But in the archaeological record of 8th century Israel and Judah, there is writing everywhere. Inscribed potsherds or ostraca begin to appear. Graves that in previous centuries would have been unmarked are now provided with inscribed epitaphs. Personal seals engraved with names and titles become common. The seals are typically made from semi-precious stones and elegantly carved. They belong, for the most part, to the wealthiest and most powerful members of society. The titles of their owners are often aristocratic or even royal. We have the seals of a number of individuals who are called Son of the King. This title might signify membership in the royal family, but even if it's only honorific, it certainly indicates high rank. The owners of other seals are called Servant of the King, a title well known from the Bible where it indicates a high-ranking position at court. One of our most beautiful seals is engraved with a roaring lion surmounting the name Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. The owner was a chief officer of Jeroboam II, who reigned over Israel for 40 years in the 8th century. Another exquisite seal, which has just come to light, belonged to a man called Avdai, the servant of Hoshea. He was a minister of Israel's last king before the fall of Samaria in 722. We also have seals with titles indicating noble professions, such as mayor, cupbearer, warden, and of course scribe. The owners of seals of this kind were members of an elite stratum in 8th century society. They were wealthy and privileged. Most were associated with the Israelite court in Samaria or the Judean court in Jerusalem. These people are well known from the Bible. Prophets like Amos and Isaiah mistrusted them, pointing to the social and economic power that was concentrated in their hands and warning of its potential for abuse. Given the high positions held by such people, it may seem surprising that prophetic criticism was tolerated, but it was. As far as we can tell, Amos received no more than a reprimand from Amaziah, who, according to the account in Amos 7, commanded him to leave the royal sanctuary, Bethel, but threatening him with nothing worse. The reluctance of kings and their lieutenants to suppress prophetic speech is sometimes explained as a result of respect for or fear of the authority of the divine word. Even treason might be tolerated in the mouth of God's representative. Probably there's truth in this line of reasoning, but we should also remember that the monarchy was never so deeply rooted in Israel and Judah that it could exercise absolute or arbitrary power. The Central Hill Country was traditionally rural, a land of Bedouin and village farmers. Urbanization and the resulting centralization of power were still relatively recent developments in the 8th century. The social stratification that Amos and Isaiah decried was not part of the ancient way of life in the region. When kingship is introduced in the biblical narrative in chapter 8 of 1 Samuel, it's presented in a way that is almost wholly negative, as if the rule of a human king was incompatible with the sovereignty of Israel's divine king. Samuel warns the people that the king they say they want will only exploit them, impressing their children into his service and taking their property for his own use. At this point, the evidence of writing is again useful. Earlier I mentioned the types of inscribed artifacts that survive from the 8th century: ostraca, gravestones, seals, but not royal monuments. There was no tradition of public inscriptions in the kingdoms of ancient Israel and Judah. We have nothing comparable to the magnificent stela erected in the 9th century BC by Mesha, king of Moab, Judah's eastern neighbor. The famous Siloam tunnel inscription from Jerusalem is not a royal monument intended for public display. It commemorates a project commissioned by King Hezekiah at the end of the 8th century. Hezekiah is not mentioned, and the inscription was carved inside a tunnel underneath the city rather than in a conspicuous public place. It's the inscription of an engineer, not a king, and it's unlikely that this absence of royal inscriptions is an accident of discovery. In contrast to the writing used by Israel's neighbors, there was no formal or monumental Hebrew script, only a cursive script suitable for producing ostraca and graffiti, but not for carving elegant stone inscriptions. When alphabetic writing came to Greece in the 8th century, the rulers of the Greek states were quick to recognize its potential political importance. Very soon, official law codes and decrees of state were being displayed in public places. But nothing like this seems to have happened in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Writing was not taken over in the service of the king. This is further evidence, I think, that the roots of monarchy were never deep in Israel. It may seem strange to speak of the vulnerability of the monarchy in the context of the 8th century, when the kingdoms of Israel and Judah reached the height of their power. Under Jeroboam II, Israel controlled territory as far north as central Syria and as far south as the Dead Sea. And under Azariah or Uzziah, Judah expanded to the shores of the Mediterranean at the expense of the Philistines, and as far south as Eilat on the Gulf of Aqaba. Archaeologists working in strata from this period find the remains of strong fortifications and substantial public buildings, and they find luxury items, like the intricately worked panels of ivory inlay that once adorned the wooden furniture of the wealthy citizens of Samaria. But the prosperity of the mid-8th century was temporary. By the end of the century, Samaria lay in ruins, and the former kingdom of Israel was a province of the Assyrian Empire. Judah was reduced to a tiny state surrounding the capital city, and Jerusalem itself had barely survived the siege of Sennacherib. Despite their power and prosperity, the 8th century kingdoms of Israel and Judah were not strong enough to resist the onslaught of the Assyrian Empire, especially after Tiglath-Pileser III seized power in 745 and reorganized its administrative infrastructure. The historian is fully justified in citing this as the cause of the 8th century collapse of Israel. But this was not Amos's point of view. Like Isaiah, he saw the Assyrian army as the agent of destruction, but not the cause. He understood the coming destruction as God's punishment of Israel. God's anger was directed at the wealthy elite of Israel, those who lie on beds of ivory. Amos said that God was going to punish Israel because its leaders sell the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals, because they trample the head of the poor into the dust of the earth.